appreciate it. Yes, and I will share my screen. There is some noise. Well, yeah. So thank you very much, Dwayne, for the introduction. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So this also to be part of this really exciting speaker series. And for me today, this is an opportunity to reflect my own work. I want to highlight some problems and barriers in dealing with documentation and exhibition of sexuality, and outline ways I have engaged with sexualities in museums and discuss that with you. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and input from you. Yeah, as Dwayne said, I'm interested in the collection and documentation practices in relation to human sexuality from a historical and cultural perspectives, and how they have shaped our understanding of sexualities, and also in how exhibitions, so the spatial presentation of objects and artworks, the narratives and the sonography, contribute to knowledge production about sexuality and shape understandings of bodies, identities, but also of history, modernity, progress, and so forth. And yeah, this interests me on the one hand theoretically. As I said in my PhD research, I'm working on LGBTIQ history exhibition. It also interests me in my practical work, working on the Naomi Rilze collection, which I will be talking about today, and also politically in my community and activist work around museums, queer archival work, and queering history. So today, we'll talk about these two things highlighted in the title. We're talking about the classification and documentation of sexuality-related objects, and I will address thesauri and controlled vocabulary that I've been dealing with a lot, and the question of language, discrimination-aware or non-discriminatory language in regard to human sexuality in museum documentation. And then the second part of the talk will address an exhibition that I did, The Eroticism of Things, and the perspectives on sexuality that we put forward in this exhibition, and how we dealt with what Jennifer Tiburzi has called patriarchal perspectivalism and heteronormativity when it comes to material culture. And maybe also dealing with the topic of sexuality in museums that normally don't address these topics, and what I've called here navigating institutions. In this talk, I will be showing a few sexual images or images that show sexuality. There won't be many, just so that people are aware today that you will also be seeing sexual content in this talk. So depending on from where you are joining us, that you might want to see how that works for you where you are at the moment. So anyone looking for objects related to sexuality in online collection database in museums is often confronted with poor results. For example, here I search for the term sexuality, or an abbreviation of it, in SMB Digital, which is the online collection database of the state museums in Berlin, with 250,000 listed objects, which only yielded 19 relevant results. So objects related to sexuality, works of art with depictions of sexual practices or references to different sexual gender identities and sexual identities are often inadequately described and tagged. And the search for marginalized sexualities is particularly difficult, as can be seen, for example, in this example, where I searched for the term lesbian, which gave no results at all. On the one hand, of course, this reflects the history of selective collection practices, or the non-collection of these objects and artworks. On the other hand, it is also due to the practice of documentation and the vocabulary used. So objects related to marginalized sexualities were and are usually not described or tagged accordingly. When objects related to sexuality are tagged, the language often reflects heteronormative, patriarchal, and racist notions. Discriminatory terms and outdated and or inconsistent vocabulary is used, as for example, in this example, where when describing the sexual act, they switch into Latin to not describe this in German as the rest of the has been described. So the classification and naming of sexual identities and practices is always imbued with power and is a specific form of discursive production of sexuality. The processes of documentation and classification in the museum are not excluded from this either. Data infrastructure is not neutral or objective, but the classification and naming of sexual identities and practices and bodies is always permeated with power and a specific form of the discursive production of sexuality. Naming and categorization, as well as silences and omissions, are part of the powerful discourse on sexuality. So thinking critically about museum documentation and language has been part of my work for quite a long time in the network Queering Museums Berlin that Dwayne mentioned, and also in the umbrella organization of the Queer Archives. And actually earlier this year, together with the Central Public Library in Berlin, we petitioned the National German Library to change and overhaul the language around LGBTIQ topics in the German authority file, which is used widely in libraries, archives, and museums. But a critical assessment of documentation practices and languages in language in relation to sexuality has also been an important work of my part of my work at the Research Center, working on the Naomi Wilczek collection, to which I will be turning now. So the Naomi Wilczek collection was put together by Naomi Wilczek, who was an erotic art collector from the United States. In her early 60s, so relatively late in her life, she started collecting sculptures, paintings, drawings, and everyday objects with sexual content from every continent and epoch. And in 2005, she opened her World Erotic Art Museum in Miami Beach on a mission to break the taboo on depictions of nudity and sexual practices, and expose the imagery of that nature to a bigger public. Being one of the few female collectors in the male-dominated field, the very male-dominated field of erotic art, she ran up against diverse hurdles and also fought the city of Miami various times in court to be able to open her museum and put the name outside, which you can see here. She believed that sexuality should be made visible as a self-evident part of the human experience, recorded in artworks by every culture of every epoch throughout human history. Ultimately, Naomi Wilczek hoped her collecting activity and museum work would help liberalize sexual mores in the United States. And she saw her work in relation to earlier pioneers of sexual liberation, such as Magnus Hirschfeld, a Berlin sexologist of the 1920s and 30s. The scope of her collection, but also the classification and presentation of the objects, were informed by a mixture of approaches and systems, by geography, topics, themes, by size, sexual practices, art style, and very much her own personal taste. As a private collector, she was not very interested in standards of documentation, preservation, or research, but rather saw the museum as a space of communication and exchange about sexuality, and later in her life spent most of her days in the museum, personally meeting visitors, giving tours and lectures, and acquiring new objects. Therefore, working with the collection with the aim of making it accessible for research for a wider audience has been challenging, to say the least, because of the lack of consistent or any documentation. The main sources have been Excel files, which included basic information about the collection, 5 catalogs she published about her collection, the objects themselves, object labels in the galleries, and a few documents about the acquisitions. One of the tasks in working with the collection has been the recataloguing and overhaul of the existing documentation and descriptions with the goal of presenting the collection in a searchable online database. This has not only been challenging because of the limited information about the objects that I just detailed, but also because of the problematic, inconsistent, patchy, veiled, outdated, and sometimes just plain wrong documentation of the collection. And I will show a few here. Therefore, this has included a critical assessment of the language and terms used to describe object types, origins, physical attributes, sexual identities, sexual practices, and depicted bodies. The descriptions of works of art and the depicted sexual representations are inscribed with a variety of norms, as can be seen in these examples here. A patriarchal and heteronormative language all too easy stipulates norms of activity and passivity, who's named first, who fucks whom, to whom is the naming of sexual practice oriented. This also applies to the naming of body parts and genitalia, with terms such as vulva, vagina, labia, vulva lips, penetration, circulation, penis, phallus, all being very much contested and used problematically. Often the language also erases same-sex sexualities and non-normative sexualities, or fetishizes and pathologizes them. This also includes, for example, descriptions of sexual violence and rape, which are often, and not only in this collection, but in general in museums, described in a veiled and very ambiguous language. And on the one hand, this originates in the lack of critical language with regard to sexuality in museums in general, as I pointed out earlier. But on the other hand, in particular in the case of Naomi Wilczek collection, they are connected to the problematic universalizing approach of understanding objects and artworks as testimonies of a universal sexual history of mankind. This approach is subject to a Eurocentric Western view, which places non-European objects in the context of Western concepts of sexuality and eroticism. And by indexing and describing objects from non-Western contexts in this way, objects that sometimes have fundamentally different understandings of gender and sexuality, or cultures that have sometimes fundamentally different understandings, describing them with Western contexts repeats a colonial erasure, or these classification and descriptions practices are complicit in reproducing and othering gaze of these objects. As with many other universal collections on the history of sexuality, the Naomi Wilczek collection is dependent on a neo-colonial art market and a global system of extraction. A discrimination-aware and critical documentation practice has therefore meant for me, or one of the aspects that has meant for me from the beginning, is an examination of the existing descriptive text, object types, keywords, and so forth. And so in the last 1.5 years, together with international students that have joined the Research Center, I have researched controlled, specific, and discrimination-aware vocabulary for the description and keywording of sexual representations and objects. And together we overhaul the documentation of 1,300 objects, which is not even half of the collection yet. For this, I heavily relied on the Arts and Architecture thesaurus from the Getty Institute, as well as Iconclass, which is the classification system for works of art. However, unsurprisingly, these also have problematic terms, omissions, and hierarchies, as can be examples seen here in the keyword coitus, cohabiting sexual intercourse. I think the heteronormative framing and language, also with the subterms, becomes quite clear why that might be that might be not best to use for the classification. But foremost, or together with the problem has been for me that for a collection that only contains explicit and implicit representations of sexuality and eroticism, the vocabulary of most thesauri is very insufficient when it comes to sexual practices and identities. And for example, here, this is the example from the Arts and Architecture thesaurus that has 2 sexual personal activities, only fellatio and sexual intercourse, as the only sexual practices, and that is only sexual practices. So therefore, I have had to use a variety of other sources for indexing and describing objects. In addition to the AAT and Iconclass, these are the Homosaurus, which is a thesaurus of LGBTIQ specific terms that was developed by the Queer Archive in Amsterdam, together with the Digital Transgender Archives. And we also cooperate with the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University in the US, who have themselves developed a thesaurus for indexing their wide-ranging collection of sexual artifacts and works of art. We also took inspiration and input from suggestions from critical discussions about language from queer and feminist sex education, feminist language criticism and art history, as well as queer theory and post-colonial research on the history of sexuality. And last but not least, of course, I also include student interns, colleagues. Oh, bless you. If that was a sneeze. Students, interns, and colleagues in the keywording and also conducted 2 workshops in order to allow more diverse perspectives on language and these objects. Changing discriminatory language in vocabulary databases and taking different sexualities in account can help make museums in general, but also the representation of this collection, less discriminatory places to work and visit. From a queer perspective, however, the sole focus on correcting classification and keywords is also problematic because it reinforces the idea that classifications are ultimately objective and can represent the ultimate truth of these objects. The revision of controlled vocabulary and normative data, or the introduction of alternative thesaurian keyword lists, is important, but at the same time, it does not question the system of classification of sexuality as such, and can leave the heteronormative basic structure untouched. So the process of revising terminology, in my opinion, can never be considered complete or absolute or finished, as language and sexuality are dynamic and changing, and there will always be new identities and names that cannot be immediately absorbed by thesauri. On the one hand, so this re-keywording and reclassification of objects also raises a number of methodological and political questions, because on the one hand, replacing old terms and classification with new ones and describing historical object with today's sexuality categories harbors the risk of anachronism. The current sexual terminology has a history of its own and is not suitable, or not always suitable, for adequately describing historical sexuality and gender relations. So the terms homosexual and heterosexual were first coined in the 19th century, and therefore might not be appropriate terms for same-sex sexuality or different sex sexuality before that time. The keywording with today's vocabulary inadmissibly disambiguates these complex historical configurations of sexuality and gender. So classification and naming are always powerful acts that are historically these are closely linked to the segregation, criminalization, and pathologization and persecution of non-normative and non-Western sexualities. So more visibility for these does not per se mean more meaning and recognition, but can also mean increased involvement in a normative power of control and disciplinary measures. In this sense, the recataloguing and re-keywording harbors the risk that the objects related to non-normative sexual identities and practices may now be filtered out and sorted out under different political conditions in the future, as they are much easier to identify. Of course, a project, a temporary project like mine cannot address all these questions sufficiently. One of the ways we have dealt with this is, for example, keeping the old descriptions for research purposes, including critical reflections in the documentation itself, making always clear who wrote what, when, and why, and of course, working interdisciplinary and institutionally, and gathering different inputs from different colleagues and people working on the documentation. But of course, there are limits of what I can do. The basis of the collection is a World Erotic Art Museum, although it has now been renamed into Wilczek Erotic Art Museum to reflect more that it is a personal collection that reflects kind of the erotic or the scope and vision of its founder and collector. Very helpful in this process of redocumenting were really the different perspectives from different international students. And I remember discussions between me, a US American, and a French student on different sexual and racial identities and how to name them, and the different kind of naming practices in these countries and settings. And also, yeah, putting into question the idea of putting together a universal applicable documentation or keywording. So this closes then the part on the question of documentation. I will now turn my attention to the exhibiting of the Naomi Wilczek collection, and I will focus on an exhibition that I did in Berlin, which then traveled to Miami in 2019. So parallel to the work on the documentation, I curated an exhibition titled The Eroticism of Things, Collections on the History of Sexuality, which I curated together with the Werkbund Archive Museum of Things in Berlin. And the exhibition highlighted the inscription of sexual meaning in everyday objects and the subsequent attribution of erotic significance to such objects. and was centrally concerned with the changing categorizations and interpretation of objects deemed erotic or pornographic, obscene, sensual, a fetish, etc. It explored the material and intangible production of eroticism and how the processes of looking and touching objects become erotic activities. The starting point of the exhibition were, next to Naomi Lutzig's collection, the collections of the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld and Alfred Kinsey. It was the 150th birthday of Magnus Hirschfeld, the Berlin sexologist. And as I said, we have a close cooperation with Alfred Kinsey, who all put together large collections of erotic and sexual materials, artworks, objects, and so forth. We looked through the collections and looked for what type of objects we found, how they were classified and organized, and what the purpose of the collections had been. In the exhibition, though, we did not reproduce the classification systems of each collector, but did present short summaries of the collection scope and classification practices. And while the focus of the research project was, and of my work, had been on the importance of collections as epistemic objects, the collaboration with the Werkbund Archive Museum of Things brought the objects themselves, the things in the collections, more into focus. So the focus of this exhibition here was on the materiality, mediality of things, as well as the ambiguity and changeability of meanings. The exhibition thus represented a new approach to exhibiting sexuality. As to my research, the topic has so far mainly been approached from an art historical, sexual, scientific, or biological perspective. The role of things in the field of sexuality has seldom been the focus of attention in exhibitions on sexuality and also on research on sexuality. Or when they are only presented as evidence of human sexual activity, for example, in the form of contraceptives, aphrodisiacs, or sex toys. Our goal was to activate the exhibition space as a place of knowledge that not only depicts a history of sexuality based on things, but also by arranging things in space and presenting objects to generate new knowledge and allow for new perspectives. The exhibition was to be used as a form of knowledge production to determine the relationship to things deemed erotic and to make their meanings as well as the intentions that are inherent in these things visible and tangible. So the questions that guided us were, what type of things could be found in the collections, which things are classified as erotic, pornographic, or sexual, and what constitutes their supposedly erotic quality? How is it that certain things are perceived as erotic? Is it the material, the shape, the surface, the context of use, the fantasies that are linked to them? Based on the different dimensions of things such as material properties, the context of use, the form, the function, and the representations, we identified different types of things which were arranged in a series of separate showcases with a short explanatory text on the respective thing type. I think that's a kind of a German, I don't know if that translates into English. So during the preparation of the exhibition, it became clear that we would not present a definition of the phenomenon eroticism, but instead focus on questioning what eroticism in relationship to things actually is. And I will not go into this further now, but the definition of eroticism and its demarcation from pornography on the one hand and its role in art, literature, and everyday life have been a controversial field for the last 300 years at least. And while we did not have that historical scope, we wanted to highlight the contingent nature, the shifting boundaries between what eroticism, pornography, art, and design are, and how they have not only changed over time, but are still contested today. And we tried to exemplify this, for example, with this sugar bowl that you can see here, which is by a Berlin porcelain manufacturer, which we came across during our research in the collection of the Museum of Things. So this sugar bowl was designed by Barbara Schmidt in 2013 and launched onto the German market in the same year. And when it came to marketing the product for a US market, the US sales manager refused to sell it because the shape of the sugar bowl was classified as too phallic or too obscene. Whereupon Kala produced a new flat lid for the US market, which you can see here. And in the exhibition, we presented the sugar bowl with the original lid in a kind of peep show. So the visitors were invited to look through a peephole in the wall behind which this sugar bowl was placed. Through this type of staging, we played with the supposed obscenity of the sugar bowl, of course, as well as with the expectation of the visitors what they would get to see there. Because staging an exhibition about sexuality, the peephole itself also evoked the topoi of secrecy, prohibition, intimacy, and the voyeuristic gaze, which are often associated with eroticism. It also addressed looking as a powerful and potentially sexualizing or erotic gesture. So while the visitors looked through the peephole, they were also being observed by other visitors, and it became a setting in which they became aware of oneself as an observer and began to observe themselves how one behaves when looking at what are deemed erotic objects. So one topic that for me or for the curatorial team became quite prominent was when we researched the collections of these three collectors. What we found almost exclusively were objects and representations from the 19th and early 20th century that were created for the view and needs of bourgeois heterosexual white European men. The erotic aspect of these objects is often that images or forms of explicit heterosexual acts or women's bodies are attached to everyday objects. Phallocentrism was also conspicuous. So when primary genital organs are shown, it is almost exclusively phalli. A vulva is very rarely shown visibly. So in our exhibition, the preoccupation with the objectification of female bodies and the binary construction of bodies with the use and perception of things was linked to the question of eroticism. So that meant eroticism for whom, through what? And the things we found in the collection made quite clear the lack of erotic things produced by and for women and LGBTIQ people. In contrast to the time of Hirschfeld and Kinsey, there is now a worldwide availability of a variety of sexual representations on the internet, and a democratization of access is taking place. In addition, the boundaries between the public and the private are changing, and sexual practice is increasingly seen as play and pleasure and a form of recreation, and is no longer only linked to attachment and procreation. And of course, this is very different from depending on where one's speaking from. And this was an exhibition staged in Berlin, so this is what I'm referring to here. However, this multiplication and de-hierarchization of sexuality is seldom reflected on the level of objects and everyday things that surround us. This dominance of patriarchal and heteronormative things and representation in the collection was a curatorial challenge because it was a central concern of us not to, what I said earlier, what Jennifer Taberzi refers to as patriarchal perspectivalism. So the staging of most often white female nude bodies in a museum context. And it was not enough for us to only contextualize these objects through text alone. That is why, on the one hand, we borrowed objects from other collections, for example, the Gay Museum in Berlin, or from private collections, which made feminist and or queer contexts of use and production connections visible. Maybe the most impressive way of presenting the current changes in sexual culture in connection with material culture and the production of goods happened in the section of sex toys. In the exhibition, we presented a large selection of historical and current sex toys. And as you can see here, I can't go further in this, maybe in the discussion, there is definitely a shift, and feminist designers and queer designers going into designing sex toys. And we also organized a sex toy presentation at the museum in cooperation with a queer feminist sex shop in Berlin. Also to connect to local community actors. And to counter the visual dominance of these heteronormative representation, we also included works of art from contemporary artists. One was by the video artist Stephanie Sarli. Stephanie Sarli, in her videos, fondles most often fruit, and herself becomes visible as an actor with her hands in the action. and an eroticism of things that might be read as a metaphor for autoeroticism, for the artist's lustful and fruitful masturbation, but which refuses a male gaze on the female body. But much further than that, the caressing, coddling, grappling, stroking, penetrating of various fruit shows how a web of affects of pleasure, amusement, ridiculousness, eroticism, stimulation, tenderness, arousal, sexualization, weighing, in everyday acts as here, such as shopping, in this case, fruit, comes into play when interacting with objects. We also invited the French photographer, filmmaker, curator, and collector Marc Martin to create an installation in the exhibition room as a space from his private collection. And the installation, en passant, recreated a male changing room as a space for erotic desire and relationships between things. In his photos, films, and exhibitions, Marc Martin deals with gay desire and eroticism of the male working world, public toilets, and smelly things. Smelly is what he terms them, smelly things. The changing room in the exhibition alternated between a sports a locker room and a workers' changing room. So if you approached it from this side, you would see a collection of used sneakers that spilled out of the metal locker that Martin had received from different men for a sneaker fetish porn film that he had made. Next to it is a jumping horse, we call it in German, I'm not sure what it's called in English. And visitors were invited to run one's hand over the leather worn or to climb on it. And if you went around it, you saw worn rubber boots, oily work gloves, a silk jock strap, a used towel, and sweaty socks that appealed to visitors' senses. So the installation addressed the eroticism of spaces such as locker rooms, changing rooms, public toilets, truck stop, which for Marc Martin have an erotic aura beyond the presence of actual people. The installation was also an attempt to break the distance that the display cases that you saw earlier put between objects and visitors, which limits the interaction and the investigation of erotic or non-erotic properties of the objects presented. In order to further bridge this gap, we also set up an interactive table or two, which were called Material Senses Lab in cooperation with two universities and students working there, which consisted of two tables on which the visitors could experience the essential properties of materials and smell, feel, hear, look, and touch the erotic material qualities of different materials. This multimedia, interactive, playful, and humorous interaction with materials really opened up a space to combine an experience of materials and a reflection about what eroticism might be in combination, in relation to things and material culture. Oh, sorry. Now, just a second. So maybe finishing off slowly. For the Museum of Things, this was the first exhibition on the topic of sexuality. Therefore, the curatorial process also required a lot of negotiations and convincing, overcoming fears of scandalization, and addressing sexist language and heteronormative framings. Being a cooperation between equal partners, so the research center at the university and the museum, proved to be possible in a constructive way. And it also helped that the director is a longstanding feminist curator. And the museum did dare to go new paths, such as the show and tell with the queer feminist sex toy shop. Nevertheless, there were things that could not be realized because of institutional fears of reputation loss, or the possibility of having to deal with difficult and explicit questions around sexuality, which again proved to me that sexuality is still not a topic like any other in museums, and very often brings up personal and emotional responses by the people involved in making an exhibition. So summing up, The small budget of the exhibition did not make it possible to realize larger installations or to invite other artists, but the hope remains that this approach of the exhibition will inspire further exhibitions. And we did have further exhibitions planned, which unfortunately, due to the COVID situation, could not be realized last year and this year. Because we do need more museum spaces in which new forms of exhibiting sexuality can be tried out and reflected upon. Spaces in which a critical handling of patriarchal, heteronormative, and racist material cultural heritage and a questioning and sidelining of a straight male gaze can be tried out beyond the commentary through exhibition text as we so often see it. However, critical work on and with collections related to sexuality should not be delegated to external artists alone. And that's maybe a little critical reflection on what we did in this exhibition too, because new curatorial strategies also need to be developed in order to break this structuring, the heteronormative structuring of collections, exhibition architecture, and formats. This includes exploring how explicit sexuality can also be made an issue. And it is important to design and create exhibition spaces that deal differently with emotions such as excitement, lust, desire, humor, and shame. And the success of the Interactive Sensing Materials Lab has shown how important it is to include the most varied of senses, the physicality of visitors, and participatory elements. In view of the lack of sexuality-related things in many museum collections and the lack of documentation or critical documentation of the objects there are, participatory elements in exhibitions on sexuality can give rise to new sexuality-related things, works of art, and oral histories in museum collections. Thank you very much.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Hannes. You've given us so much to think with. Your talk was so rich and comprehensive, and many congratulations on some of the really exciting and stimulating and engaging work that you've done over the last few years. I mean, the project of intervening in existing collections and that are existing out there. I was particularly struck by your political activist engagement with the German National Libraries about changing the language in those particular archives. So that's a real practical intervention in an existing archive that is widely used to make it more inclusive. And it was really, really exciting to see this intersection between your scholarly work and your political activist work. And that seems to be the premise or the fulcrum from which your work is actually engaged. And there was just so much. For example, I'll never look at the Sugar Bowl again in the same way again. Like I'll never think about it again. But I thought maybe I could formulate a few questions just to get us going, and then you can take some time to respond, and then we can open up for the audience. So I'll start in reverse order of your presentation. So what I found really fascinating was about when you were talking about your exhibition, Erotic Things, that there was this, especially in relation to what you spoke about this Sugar Bowl, which was seemingly innocuous, but hyped to be highly problematic. And then you play this joke on your visitors by inviting them, a really revealing joke, by inviting them to indulge in this peep show that like where they see this innocuous object, and so you really open up and you play with the idea of eroticism and what is erotic. So what came out for me was that you really focused on the visual and the gaze as a very patriarchal sensibility that operates inside the museum space. So it's not just about, you quote Jennifer Tybersky from that famous book, Sex Museums, right? And I mean, even the cover of that book is also, it homes in on this ideas of visuality. So patriarchal perspectives really comes down to this idea of the gaze and the visual and how the visual operate inside the museum. So I'm thinking about sex and the senses and different sensory modalities, evoking these inside the museum setting as a way of queering engagement with collections, but also queering the museum space as one that is not dominated by these patriarchal perspectives that you highlight. So sex and the senses and the museum as a patriarchal space. So that I found really fascinating in relation to this exhibition, among one of many, many other things. And then on the topic of documentation of collections and the language that is available to us in thesauri and existing archives and what you can search and what you can't search. It's of crucial importance that we do have access. It's of crucial importance that we have a diverse language for accessing and understanding different phenomena through archival registers, right? But you also highlight that on the one hand, we have to attend to both the fixity of this language, but also the mutability of that language, right? So you spoke about towards the end of your presentation on that section, you spoke about heterosexual and homosexual as terms that were coined in the 19th century. So there are terms of their time. They describe particular kinds of relationships of that time. And they work to fix a whole constellation of other kinds of relationships around it. So they have a historical context in which they operate. And now in the present day, we need to question those kinds of constructions because they have all kinds of effects that you highlight. Social effects, real material social effects. And we need to intervene and interrupt those kinds of social effects. But you also point out that there's a tension between intervening in those terms and the importance of holding on to them for historical research, because it comes down to that problematic formulation that I don't really like about substitution and erasure. So you're erasing the problematic terms, or you're taking the statues away and you're doing away with it. And that's not the way to go about critical political work. So I was hoping that you could maybe just elaborate a little bit more on that tension between actively engaging with problematic language that exists in our archives in ways that help us to negotiate both the significance in the past, but also the times and the political climate that we actually live in at the moment. And then the last question that I had was about the Naomi Wilczek collection. Yeah, she seems like such an interesting collector of erotic art, and she brands a museum as the World Erotic Art Museum, and like extends her own taste and interest in erotic art as that which is universal to everyone. This is the World Erotic Art Museum. This is what it's all about. When of course we know that there's all kinds of problems with that. And on the website that you shared with me, the word cultural history comes up quite frequently, and I was interested in this idea of these cultural histories of sexuality, like especially since some of the collections that sit adjacent to us and the ones that you reference in the exhibition, the exhibition of erotic things, are very scientific exhibitions. They're highly scientific exhibitions. The collections, I mean, these are collections that are designed to facilitate the mapping and documentation of human sexuality, especially Western human sexuality, right? So I'm wondering about this relationship between the science of sex and cultural histories of sex, and how like where the curatorial can intervene in these boundaries that exist between the two, between these two fields, and if that's even a relevant question at all. So thanks so much for a really wonderful presentation of your work, and I'm looking forward to your responses. And
thank you, Dwayne. These are you bring up such good questions. Let me go trace them backwards because they're fresh on my memory. So I think, the cultural history of sexuality is the name of the research center that I work at, which kind of tries to highlight that we address sexuality from kind of different perspectives or different cultural artifacts. So there are historians, I myself, anthropologist, or museum studies scholar, then people working in literature and so forth. So that was maybe the perspective. That is definitely, I don't think, the perspective of Naomi Wilczek. I think Naomi Wilczek saw herself as an art collector, and she framed the collection in terms of art. That's why it's called erotic art. And that is, I think, I would see different strategies at place here. So this has to do with politics of respectability in the US also, of displaying these materials and kind of elevating them through this term. Then of course the term erotic art is an established term since, I would say, early 20th century, as a term for describing a very ambiguous term for describing a certain set of materials and framing it in that way. And also she made certain decisions to, for example, not collect certain types of materials, such, for example, photography. There's no photography in her collection because for her, that was way too close to what she deemed pornography. So it's quite interesting. Quite contrary, for example, to Magnus Hirschfeld and Kinsey, who are both sexologists, who in the early and mid 20th century heavily relied on photography and collecting photography as a means of producing knowledge about sexuality. So there's really a difference. But what really struck us when we went through the exhibition is that we found so many similar or even the same objects in these collections. So while they all three had kind of different logics, different political agendas, and also different theories of sexualities behind them, they did collect similar objects, and we tried to kind of highlight the ways they made sense of that. And I think Naomi Wilczek did not have, and I tried to lay that out, did not have a scientific approach to her collecting practice. I think that also made her interesting for us because, it's a male-dominated, view also in terms of collecting the sexologists and their collection practices. So it was also interesting, the eclectic way of her putting things together. And this was really, she put a Rembrandt print next to a glass table that had an erotic feature. So she also crossed, boundaries between high art, low art, these kind of categories that are around. So I would say, framing it, I think this was our perspective in framing or bringing in what we've termed, looking at a cultural history of sexuality. Might be different, for example, a political history of sexuality, a sociological, a biological, a sexological view at the history of at sexuality. So trying to frame it, and of course, for me in my work, through material culture. And I mean, there's more to say about the different approaches and means and ways they put these objects to use, or exhibiting these materials and from their collections to use. And I think the exhibition kind of had both parts. On the one hand, it focused on the collections because we wanted to show that these objects didn't come from anywhere, somewhere, and what we think is erotic, but we culled them from specific collections. But on the other hand, our main focus wasn't then to investigate those collections, but rather the materiality and material culture and objects. So we also only focused on a section of the collections. We didn't focus on the paintings, on the drawings, and so forth. So on different other material types that were also in the collections. Maybe I'll jump to the first one, then to your question about the people and the different addressing the different senses. And that's definitely, I mean, in the final closing statement is what I said. I think the reality of putting together an exhibition, anyone who's curated exhibition, there's a lot of practicabilities involved. So of course these display cases were there and we could use them, and we didn't have the money to buy or get new ones or produce new display cases. So they kind of framed the way we were able to present objects to. I mean, there were other display cases which we have chose, but the display case was kind of, and it very much frames the way you engage. And I think this is not only true, of course, for the topic of sexuality, but in general, this has been a debate and research, of course, on what the display case does in the exhibition space. But I think specifically, of course, it reduces the engagement with an object to the gaze. And as you've rightfully said, for us, that's why we staged this peep show at the beginning of the exhibition, because I think exhibitions that specifically or explicitly address sexuality, people come in with expectations of what to see, and also with we wanted to kind of address this wanting knowledge, this looking that is always connected also to desire, which can be desired, which can be unwanted looking. So this question of looking, desire, sexuality, and object, to address this quite at the beginning. But on the other hand, of course, that's why we had this installation by Marc Martin, and also this interactivity, this material senses lab. We are quite clear that the engagement with the objects through display cases is a very limited one, especially when it comes to desire, sexuality, and eroticism. So that was one way of trying to counter that. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think I would have had more ideas also of how to engage more senses, to play with the exhibition space, maybe also more. I think the space itself can also create atmosphere and so forth. So yeah, I think we do need different ways of addressing the topic of sexuality. And I think that also comes for what I said, negotiating or navigating these institutions. I think there is a lot of fear, sometimes also lack of knowledge, lack of fear of also retribution from donors, from museum stakeholders who do not want these kind of sexuality addressed or not in that way. And also often very personal feelings that people have to sexuality, of shame, of not knowing, of how to talk about it, of what is deemed respectable, acceptable to show, how to talk about with whom, of course. So just to give one example, one discussion point was, would there be a warning sign at the beginning, at the entrance to this specific exhibition? And you mentioned in Sex Museum, she wrote a whole chapter on warning signs and sexuality exhibitions, because I mean, it's quite interesting that we have so many exhibitions on all kinds of topics that are disturbing and, problematic and discriminatory and so forth. But most often warning signs, I mean, there are other instances where we also regularly have warning signs, but for sex exhibitions addressing sexuality, that is often the case, and is often framed as a warning sign. So we need to warn people that sexuality is going to happen. And so that was a discussion. How would we frame the sign? How would that be phrased? What would be on it? Would it be a warning? Would it be an invitation? So I think there's ways of negotiating. How would then this exhibition also be framed within the institution itself, just by this small sign, which kind of sets a tone, sets an attitude towards something like that. And another example would be definitely that I had urged for more participatory elements of people bringing their own objects, of describing their own relationships, of kind of leaving notes about their favorite erotic objects or their least favorite, and there was quite a reluctance to have these participatory elements in the fear of being confronted with, for example, sexual imagery that people would draw onto things, of sexually explicit words or notes that people would put up. And that kind of showed to me, well, we are doing an exhibition about sexuality, so people are going to address this explicitly, and isn't that good? And they would say, well, we would have all these penis drawings, and I would say, yes, well, no, of course, only drawing penises is very patriarchal, and we don't only want penises, but all types of genitals represented in this. But the thing that people draw genitals isn't the problem. So, for example, that was the case where that then didn't happen. We didn't have these participatory elements because of lack of. Also, maybe that would have needed the front desk staff to be trained in this, to be more involved in the process, and there weren't the funds for them to do this or to go on this road.
I like this. I like this mentioning of boundaries and sensitivities in this institutions, and it's a very different. It goes against my normative perceptions of institutions in Berlin. And it also goes to show that the kind of conservatism and sensitivities that you would normally associate with, yeah, like you wouldn't assume an institution like that to have those kinds of conservative sensitivities around this.
I wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't, as I said, I wouldn't even always frame them as conservative. And I mean, I think part of that is Berlin marketing that is fooling everyone. Berlin is this place where, no, I think, and especially through my work, the network Queering Museums Berlin, I encounter this through working together with colleagues in all kinds of institutions, that sexuality and LGBTIQ topics even more so are very much a contentious topic still. And this is always then dependent on people. And this isn't necessarily, for example, in this case, it wasn't the case that they themselves didn't, but it was a fear of retribution. How would we handle this if this was then scandalized that we were showing these kinds of materials to school kids? Because that was one thing that I didn't mention in the talk. We also had an education program for schools in this exhibition, and quite explicitly, I included this into the programming because I had worked at other museums before, at the Gay Museum for a long time, and had noticed that there really is a lack of talking about sexuality in museums, and also of methodology of talking about sexuality. And so I brought together sex educators and museum educators to develop a program to talk about this. And they were open to this, and they did this, so they were very upfront. But still, again, there were a lot of fears, and I think, Brett, there's an association and there's different actors, and I think that just shows the contentious, or the way sexuality still is perceived as a very contentious topic, and of course is instrumentalized by the right, by conservative actors, by people who instrumentalize this to gain all kinds of political gains and so forth. And to be caught up in something like that is also something that a museum that does that has to prepare, kind of, or be willing to also engage with. And yeah, so that was definitely also a topic. I mean, the response was amazing. It was great. We had so many visitors. There was nothing like that, and I think the museum was very happy that they went along with this road, and it was an all over very great experience, I think, for the museum.
Wonderful, Hannes, and especially in that museum. I mean, the Werkbund Museum, this Museum of German Design and Craftsmanship. It's such an interesting space to actually host an exhibition like that. So at this point, I know that you wanted to jump into some of the other responses, but maybe we can just open up some space and catch some breathing room to take some questions from our audience. Please raise your hands and
comments.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, remarks, maybe experiences you've had. It would be lovely to hear that.
So Pippa, I see that you have your hand up. For the rest of our audience members, please drop questions or comments in our chat box. We really want to diversify the range of perspectives here as well. Pippa, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you very much for a really interesting talk. It sort of struck me, I mean, in a way that I haven't thought about very much before, but that there's a kind of human exceptionalism that's at the heart of these kinds of projects. And obviously, focusing them on objects is a function of that. But if you think about some of the taboos, some of the scandals, some of the fears around exhibitions like this, they often have to do with the idea that this is aberrant behavior. But if one looks at the animal kingdom, you're looking at oral sex, you're looking at non-reproductive sex, you're looking at sex across species, you're looking at every possible kind of non-heterosexual sexual practices, from consuming your partner to things that it's apparently just done for pleasure. So why do you leave out animals? Why just humans? I mean, why not an exhibition that in some way contextualizes human behavior as part of the behavior of just yet another species?
I think that is one way, and there have been exhibitions by natural history museums who do kind of show up the range of animal sexualities, and I don't know if they necessarily place human sexuality in that range too, in there too. I would make two qualifications. I think on the one hand, that because you said, there's a human exceptionalism, and if it would be placed in the context of animal sexuality, or as a one of many species that has sexuality, as a strategy for gaining acceptance for the topic, or less retribution, or in a way of that would be easier. And I would think that is not necessarily the case, that by framing it that way, because this could also be used quite against saying like, well, the majority of animals does not engage in certain kinds of behaviors, or these types of animals don't do that. So, this is still aberrant behavior. Why do you, and this of course has been a way how, non-heterosexual sexualities have often been delegitimized through recourse to animal sexual behavior. So of course there are, drawing on animal sexual behavior to kind of legitimize or gain acceptance for human sexual behavior has been tried. I think my approach would also be to say, well, there is a distinction between human sexuality and animal sexuality, and also because I am not, that's my way of engaging with this. I am interested in the cultural artifacts in material culture, and how through material culture and art, human sexuality is transformed, expressed, transmitted, and through, of course, what I said earlier, the collection practices, the naming practices, and so forth, how a notion of sexuality is constructed. And of course, the construction of animal sexuality and how that is done through similar practices in natural history museums, science museums, personal collections, and so forth, is also, could be, I think definitely there's a crossover. And when we look at these historical collections of Hirschfeld and Kinsey and other sexologists, they definitely do have those elements too, that they draw on animal sexual behavior. And Kinsey was a zoologist, a trained zoologist who came from zoology to human sexuality. So they do have these elements in their collections. But I would be more interested how how human animal sexuality is correlated or kind of used to kind of in a discourse around human sexuality to make sense of human sexuality. Maybe that gives an answer. I saw one exhibition on animal sexual behavior that kind of highlighted the range of it, but then again at the end did kind of center heterosexuality, animal heterosexuality in their presentation. So I think that then also depends how is animal sexuality related in these exhibitions. But it's definitely
that's a wonderful response, Hannes, because I'm also thinking about the way in which, as you say, the patriarchal perspective travels not only from representations of human sexuality, but it travels across a range of collections and representations of sexuality. It's not exclusive to representations of human sexuality. And but I was also wondering, since we are the keepers of the Bleek and Lloyd archive, and I was wondering about the sexuality and the languages of sexuality that may percolate in the archives that we actually keep. I know there are references to all kinds of relationships and kinship relationships, but could you say maybe just briefly about any of the references to sexuality that may appear in the archive that could be relevant for us for thinking about this in relation to our own work?
I think in short, there's very little. From Blake and Lloyd's point of view, it struck a chord when you mentioned how a lot of terminology is rendered in Latin. And that's the same in this archive. You have things like, in the dictionary, body parts, genitals, and so on will be rendered in Latin. Or, for instance, you have something that says back, lower back, opposite side. So, you know, but that's from Blake and Lloyd's perspective. But, you know, anthropologists, for instance, who have looked at that archive and then think about the work that they've done, say in the Kalahari or whatever, do note a total absence of kind of ribald and sexual references in that archive. And I imagine the home environment of two Victorian, or a Victorian woman in particular, would not encourage those informants to use the kinds of language that's you know, evidently used quite easily in you know, in the experience of anthropologists, particularly male anthropologists in other communities. So, you know, I don't think there's a good source in that archive for this kind of thinking.
So it seems as if there's a little bit of a gap for exploring sex and sexuality, the hidden sex and sexuality in the Blake and Lloyd archive, and what that can actually reveal to us, new things that it can actually reveal to us, especially considering the gendered relations of the knowledge production process.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there's a big absence there. But I take all your points. But I do think, you know, a lot of these other fora that explore animal sexuality, you know, tend to present a very one-sided perspective on it. You know, I think in the animal kingdom, monogamy, for instance, is the big anomaly. It's the, you know, the biggest, what is the word? It's our natural behavior in a way. And yet, I just do think that keeping these domains separate, you know, sort of generates ideas that are understood to be just, you know, very particularly human, and they're not.
Thanks, Pippa. Frissa, I see that you're...
no, I just wanted to follow on from that about, I mean, yes, there've been exhibitions about animal sexuality, but maybe it's not about animal eroticism. So, I mean, maybe that's the space between the two, and I'm sure animals do experience eroticism, but that hasn't been something that people have focused on. But I was interested in the erotic and your the eroticism of things as the framing for your exhibition, because as artists, and this is something that Rodwin is here, and something that we brought up in the print project, and Pippa and I know have spoken about a lot, is as artists, there's an eroticism in the making of work, particularly we feel as printmakers. You know, all those, the pleasure, the desire, the touch, and all of that goes into the making of these artworks, which have these sort of imprinted, embedded eroticism, which becomes dormant in a sense, as then they go out into the world and become these other objects. So I was interested in that eroticism of things and sort of bringing back the erotic to these objects, not the things that we obviously associate with eroticism, but other forms of objects. And that's why I think that table of materials that you had in your exhibition was very interesting, and how one experiences through matter, sort of tactile matter, the erotic. It made me think of an exhibition, I don't know whether you ever saw it. Dan Vo had an exhibition in Venice, Slip of the Tongue, in 2015 or so. Which I don't think he overtly intended to be a highly erotic exhibition, and yet it was. Just in because of the way in which he curated it, and within the particular space, which is gorgeous. But the relationship between those objects, how as a viewer one experiences in extreme eroticism looking at these things which are not designed as such, which I thought was very interesting, just in terms of a curator and what a curator can do with objects.
Thank you. Yeah, that is brings so much to like what we also talked about. I mean, the experience that we had going through the collection was, well, they are highly unerotic collections when we culled from the collections. So I think that this idea of intentional or unintentional eroticism, I think that what the title, I mean, says the eroticism of things, but what of course we try to convey is that eroticism is not an inherent quality of objects themselves, but a process, you know, an interaction between humans and things on the one hand. And I think what you're rightly pointing out is what we did not focus on, for example, is the production process of things, or how the production of artworks or things can itself also contribute to an erotic aspect or be an erotic aspect of things. I think something that would definitely kind of contributed to an understanding of eroticism and what it is. I think the question for us was also, well, we had long discussions about what does constitute eroticism. Of course, did not come into one designation. And I think it's interesting, when I gave tours through the exhibition, I always, also was very inquisitive, have the visitors voice their opinion or their notions of what eroticism is. And the most interesting discussions came about when the visitors among themselves and the groups discussed what is erotic or not. And also in this material senses lab, people could leave notes. So there were kind of cards that people could write on what kind of materials they think are erotic or sensual. And the range of materials and situations that people voiced in those cards was really spoke to the malleability of eroticism. And I think what we tried to do a little bit, although there wasn't much space, was also give a historical background on this term eroticism, which nowadays we often think in kind of an antithesis to pornography, that pornography and eroticism are two different things. And to show how that border of what constitutes pornography or eroticism, and that they would be something mutually exclusive, is a very recent mid-20th century development, that we understand this word in this sense. And I think, yeah, there wasn't a lot of space in the exhibition to do that, but I think the production aspect was one that would have been great to look up. And I think also in the way of including artists, I said at the end of my talk, I think it's oftentimes curators then invite artists or get artworks that kind of, and I think art has a lot of, and we really experienced that in the exhibition, that this installation brought a whole different kind of interaction with the shoes, with the smell, with the space itself. But I think it's always, I think there needs to be a curatorial engagement also, and not put all that work, have them do it. And I think engaging artists in different ways also, maybe in more, highlighting more the process of making art as an erotic practice, like you said, that would definitely also be, yeah, something that I haven't thought about. That would be great to take on. Thank you.
That's a very fascinating tangent. Thanks for raising that, with the process of actually making art and imbuing art with a kind of erotic sublime that doesn't get communicated in the artwork itself. It's through the process of making it that it gets imbued with a kind of eroticism. We also have a couple of responses in the chat box. So Nina Liebenberg is here. Nina, would you like to come on stage and pose your question? I think you'd be able to articulate it quite more clearly than I would. And then Ronwin, thanks for the reference, Ronwin. I think that's going to be a nice reference for us all. The darker side of light, arts of privacy, as an interesting read on the influence of eroticism in print. So thanks for sharing that reference. So Nina, you had a question?
Hi, Anders. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was so interesting. And I really love your exhibition. The question is really kind of focused on the exhibition, which I wasn't there to see. So I want you to talk some more about some of the display strategies and the curatorial strategies that you used. And I think I really want to hear more about your thing types or the new categories that you imposed on these objects as you pulled them back. And I think what Duane said right at the beginning, it's so lovely how you started with the process of the metadata and expanding the metadata, and then in the exhibition kind of formulating these new strategies which then and their own little vitrines. But if you can speak a little bit more about what those types were, that would be really wonderful. And then also, if there is time, I mean, you were talking about, I was very interested in the educational program that ran with the exhibition. And I always think it's such an interesting process how these educational, the people that do the educational programs use the material in the exhibition and translate it into something that then becomes material for the school children to use. So I would just be interested to hear more about how they used your material and your display strategies, and then converted that into something that kids do in terms of activities, or expands that the material of the exhibition for them specifically. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this was really a crucial perspective also in the collaboration between the Research Center and the Museum of Things. So they are a Museum of Product Culture, which have like really also contributed to the theoretical or theorization of things, and in a Latourian sense of like engaging with materiality and the agency of things. And so this was definitely where like our both perspectives of collections and things came together in this process of coming up with these object types, and we kind of shifted around a lot what would contribute a type, being quite aware, of course, that it is an arbitrary, that it is, you know, it was a playful approach also to think about what and to kind of get away also from the classifications of the collectors that we engaged with. So kind of like getting a new perspectives that would focus on this. So one of the categories was biomorphous objects, so which we found often, which are kind of vases, stones, forth, that have kind of body-like appeal, that were like biomorphic, and which would have an, because they would kind of seem like a part of a body or a shape of a body, and that way have an erotic appeal. They could be natural objects, produced objects, like all kinds of different that we found. The other one that we called body parts, those were some of the ones that I showed. So often these would be household objects, kind of quite sexist often, that would have kind of, you know, penises, phalluses, breasts, like in all kinds of different connotations in the way the object was used, or was often then quite integral. The nutcracker with the legs, and kind of all these kind of ways the body is then the object itself is in the shape of a body. Then we had something like the classical erotica, where you would have an object that would only be kind of the carrier of an image. So you would have a snuff box, and you would have a hidden image, erotic image inside. So actually the object itself isn't, but it's more, I mean, and of course this question of secrecy and exposing and looking and finding, that itself becomes an erotic activity in dealing with, but the object itself is the image then that provokes, that has that erotic connotation, for example. Then we had these sex toys that we showed. So objects that were produced for sexual pleasure, objects that are used for sexual stimulation and mutually or alone. That's one category. Then we had a category of objects that are repurposed maybe for sexual activities, either in fantasy or in play. So that was also very playful, going through the collection of the Museum of Things and looking through and finding materials that are kind of, you know, bring up associations for different, and like we did this with different people working in the museum too. So to come up with a range of objects that, I mean, some people's, you know, cellophane wrap, or, you know, a household object that people might be more attuned to or know, or kind of have a direct response to of how that is eroticized. But often objects, we also looked at objects where the Museum of Things didn't know what they were. So they have lots of objects that come through bigger collections, and it's a part of an instrument or an apparatus or something, and they don't know what their function is. And so we put some of those in there too, to kind of open up, well, if we don't know, let's give that possibility to that object too. So that was a category. Then we had a category of fetish objects. So in the narrow sense, what historically and today has been, you know, deemed as a sexual fetish. So kind of different types of materials, objects, stockings, latex. The shoes that you show, the sneakers, so like a sneaker fetish, which is quite prominent in gay subculture, maybe in Berlin and elsewhere. So kind of objects that are specifically, and for example, the chandelier that you saw in one of the images that we put up there is also in direct connection to a story that Hirschfeld tells in one of his books about a fetishist for crystal glass, and how that fetishist then describes being in love with crystal glass and masturbating to crystal glass. And so also trying to get objects that people would not necessarily immediately think of as erotic, and show the kind of the malleability and variability. I think those were it. Maybe we had, yeah, with one more nature thing. So we had natural objects. That was a separate collection from someone who had collected stones, a geologist working at the university, a person who had a private collection of erotic stones, all classified according to geological denominations. So that was kind of a subsection. I think those were the main categories that we put up now. And in terms of the educational program, yeah, maybe not surprisingly, the educational program didn't hit off schools did not really take on that. And I think that has to do with the topic that teachers are, and I think it has to do with the word erotic, which brings up a lot of questions for teachers to address that a lot of them maybe not be able and willing to address, even just wanting to go there. Of course, also it has to fit in their curriculum and so forth, what they want and need to address. And I think what was crucial for the educational program was bringing together sex educators and museum educators, because in my experience, museum educators often have a great knowledge of working with objects in a museum space, but often lack the ability and knowledge of talking about sexuality. And I mean explicitly talking with teenagers in a sensible and educational way and about sexuality. I think that's a different set of skill sets that often museum educators don't have. Sex educators, on the one hand, do have that down. They really know how to talk about sex with kids, with all types of people, and also addressing certain, and have a lot of knowledge also about sexuality, but often don't really know how to engage in a museum space or how to include objects and also bring in other perspectives that might be more cultural, historical perspectives to the question of addressing sexuality. So that was really an interesting process of bringing these two groups together. There's also friction and tension in that wasn't like, because they are really different perspectives and there's different ways of working. So for example, in a museum space is not a safe space because you're in an open space, other visitors might walk through. Sex educators often work in a closed space. The teacher should not be there. It's a safe space. You can ask anything. It's very private, very intimate. Museum space isn't that. So you have to adapt, find new methodologies. And so we cooperated with the British Museum because they have a great program talking about sex in the British Museum with a colleague, an artist who does that work there. And so we invited her also to a workshop to give input on how kind of the work that she does there and how that has worked. She's really amazing, Chloe Cooper. I can put that, I can send that after if you're interested in that. And so that was an interesting process. And the good thing was through this network curating museums, a colleague of mine who worked at the Bode Museum, another museum, then kind of took on the museum educators and the sex educators for their own program at the Bode Museum, which was called Let's Talk About Sex, which was much more successful. They transformed it, also didn't use the word erotic in it. I mean, there's other ways why that was successful because they have a big group of schools coming into their programming anyway. But the good thing was really that the kind of the reflective process and thinking also through methodology didn't just end with the exhibition, but could be passed on, and kind of that knowledge, people could draw on that. And also the people, I mean, this is also about people, being paid or free. They're both freelancers, often museum educators, sex educators. And that was also, for example, sex educators earn a lot more than museum educators. I mean, 3 to 4 times as much. And that, of course, causes tension when you're putting together a team of how much you pay. I mean, there's kind of practical questions also of building such an educational program. But your question, I mean, I'm rambling on here. Please stop me, Dwayne. So the question, we said, how do they make use of the objects? So the idea was, on the one hand, to talk also about some of the topics. For example, what is eroticism? What is pornography? And to use objects to question that. And for example, I remember being there with a group that was already first semester students, and there was a small watch that had kind of a double lid, and in the lid was a heterosexual scene, sexual scene, penetrative vaginal sex being displayed there. And then I said, well, this is, is this pornography or not? And they said, well, no, that's not pornography. That's so small, that's not pornography. I'm like, oh, well, I mean, and so for them, they said, well, it's a picture, it's painted, it's not even a photography, so it's not porn. And it was really interesting to think about how these categorizations, so for them, it would have to be a moving image or a photography for it to be classified as pornography and have a certain kind of dimension or anything. So it was really interesting discussions to use these objects to talk about classification and also about current day issues. So that was the idea, how these objects were supposed to be used. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Hannes, for that really rich and rich and detailed explanation of the educational role of using the erotic and sex as an interface for these different museum workers and people outside the museum also, as like fostering a space of mutual learning and exchange. I didn't know that sex educators were paid much more than museum workers. It makes me rethink my career choices now also. Maybe I should.
The museum educators, yeah. Because they're at the bottom of the ladder often in museums in terms of pay as freelancers and so forth, yeah.
And I think what I really took away from your presentations was like, yeah, these ideas of playfulness, of the evocativeness of sex and the erotic, for pulling out and showing us so much more about what museums can actually do and what they can actually be as places. Like, let's play around with sex and the erotic in the museum, and play around with how they can shake up or unsettle our ideas of thingness and classification in the museum. And that was so refreshing for me about your presentation. So many thanks for that, Hannes. Before we conclude, you have a conference coming up at the end of the year.
Oh yes, thank you so much for reminding me. Yes, so together with colleagues from Miami, the educator who works there, and the Kinsey Institute, I'm putting up, hosting a conference called Exhibitionism, Sexuality at the Museum. It will take place on November, I will type it in the chat, December 9th to December 11th, bringing together curators, educators, researchers, artists working on sexualities in museums. It will be an online conference for 3 days, and you can start registering now, and it's cheap to register. And I think it's going to be really an amazing program. We've tried to bring together also people from different parts of the world, from different types of museums, working on topics of sexuality. And I should have prepared this.
No problem at all. Wonderful. Thanks for dropping that in the chat. So anybody who wants to participate, please pick up the link. We'll also circulate the link and any other links that you think relevant, Hannes, on the little write-up that we will have for this particular presentation.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really been a pleasure.
No, thank you, Hannes.
My work, and also an opportunity that sometimes in the daily grind of working, to have that chance to reflect on your practice again. So thank you for giving me this opportunity and for all your questions and comments. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hannes, and thank you so much to our guests also who came in today to our Spidals talk. The next Spidals talk will take at the end of October. It's been lovely to take a short little summer break at the end of August in the global north. Many people are away on summer vacation, so we thought we'd time it in that way. But we'll come back at the end of October. So thank you so much to all of those who came to participate today. Thank you again, Hannes. Thank you to Nina Liebenberg, also my co-host, for helping to assist with these talks. And we'll see you at the end of October again for the Spiral series.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks to you, Juan. Bye.